Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving straight into a massive turning point in aviation history. We are exploring how the absolute worst mid-air collision on record served as the definitive catalyst for India to pioneer global air safety and frankly mandate the groundbreaking technology that protects every single one of us when we fly today. It's a story of unimaginable tragedy, for sure, but also of incredible systemic modernization.
Now, to really grasp this modernization, we've got to go back to the evening of November 12, 1996. The timeline is chilling. At 03:55 p.m., a chartered Kazakhstan Airlines flight takes off from Shymkent, heading right towards New Delhi. Later that evening, a Saudi Airlines flight departs from Delhi. Down on the ground, air traffic controller VK Dutta is guiding both planes. He clears the departing Saudi flight to climb to 14,000 feet, and meanwhile, he instructs the incoming Kazakh flight to hold its altitude at 15,000 feet. On his radar screen, Dutta is just watching these two aircraft as simple blinking dots. But then, the unthinkable happens. He watches, literally helpless, as those two dots move closer, fuse into a single bright dot, and then just disappear entirely. About 100 kilometers away, over the city of Charkhi Dadri, residents saw a bright flash, heard a massive thunderclap, and were suddenly showered in iron debris.
Okay, let's dive into this. We're going to break it down into 5 parts. First, the disaster itself. Second, the outdated rules of the sky. Third, we'll look at the Swiss cheese model. Fourth, India's massive TCAS mandate. And finally, a safer global sky. Let's get to it.
Part 1. The Charkhi Dadri disaster. Look, before we get into the tech and the systems, we absolutely must acknowledge the immense human element of this 1996 crash. It remains the worst air disaster in India's history. You had over 300 passengers on that Saudi flight, and the vast majority were Indian blue-collar workers, folks traveling to the Middle East to support their families. And on the Kazakh flight, the passengers were primarily Kyrgyz traders heading to India to buy wool. The loss of life was just absolute and devastating. To understand how a tragedy of this magnitude happens, we have to look at the baseline rules. In aviation, there is a golden rule, 1,000. By international standards, there must always be a minimum vertical distance of 1,000 feet between two aircraft. It's the buffer that keeps the sky safe. But on that fateful evening, that critical 1,000-foot separation violently failed.
Moving on to Part 2, outdated rules of the sky.
So why exactly did that rule fail? Well, we have to step back into the high-stress, incredibly manual aviation environment of the 1990s. The systems governing the sky back then were vastly different from today, and they unwittingly set the perfect stage for disaster. In the 90s, ATCs in India were entirely dependent on older primary radar. Think of primary radar as bouncing radio waves off a metal plane just to get its horizontal distance. But crucially, it cannot tell you the aircraft's altitude. Secondary radar, on the other hand, actively communicates with the transponder on the plane to give you precise real-time vertical data. But here's the kicker. At the time of the crash, secondary radars were not yet in use in India, so air traffic controllers were essentially blind to an aircraft's exact height on their screens. Because they lacked that automatic altitude data, an ATC's job was brutally tedious. They had to constantly radio pilots asking, "Hey, what's your altitude?" And when the pilot replied, the ATC would manually write down the height and speed and then manually calculate the flight path. Imagine doing this human calculator routine for 20 to 30 flights every single hour at a massive hub like Delhi. On top of that, all incoming and departing planes were forced to share a single bidirectional air corridor. It is no wonder at all that in the 1990s, being an air traffic controller was voted the most stressful job in the world, literally considered more stressful than being a surgeon.
Which brings us to Part 3, the Swiss cheese model.
So you might be wondering, with an incredibly stressful environment and outdated tech, how does a disaster of this specific magnitude actually bypass highly trained experts? Surely one single mistake shouldn't cause two planes to collide, right? And this brilliantly illustrates how safety experts analyze these things, using what's called the Swiss cheese model. Imagine stacking multiple slices of Swiss cheese. The holes in the cheese represent small mistakes, systemic flaws, or human errors. Usually an error is caught because the hole in one slice doesn't line up with the hole in the next. Actually, it's more like the solid part of the cheese just stops the error in its tracks. But a disaster happens when, against all odds, the holes perfectly align, allowing that error to pass completely through the system unchecked.
When investigators finally recovered the black box flight data recorders, they found the exact holes that aligned that evening. First, despite being explicitly told to hold at 15,000 feet, the Kazakh plane had descended to 14,000 feet, putting it directly in the path of the Saudi flight. Why? Well, cockpit audio revealed the Kazakh pilots were distracted, just complaining among themselves about airport delays. Even worse, there was a fatal language barrier. The pilots didn't understand English well enough to communicate with the Delhi ATC themselves. They had to rely on a radio operator to translate the English instructions into Russian, which led to a deadly misunderstanding of their cleared altitude. Add in the fact that both planes were flying directly at each other in that outdated single-corridor system, and boom, the Swiss cheese holes perfectly aligned.
Part 4. India mandates the TCAS system.
Now, the realization of these compounding failures sparked a fierce determination to ensure this could never, ever happen again. India aggressively moved to plug these systemic holes and wound up leading global safety. Following the tragedy, India's Civil Aviation Minister, C.M. Ibrahim, delivered a really bold, uncompromising mandate. By December 31, 1998, every single aircraft with 30 or more seats operating in Indian airspace had to be fitted with TCAS, the Traffic Collision Avoidance System. Now, you have to realize at the time, TCAS was bleeding-edge, incredibly expensive tech. Many international airlines complained bitterly. They argued they couldn't afford to retrofit their entire fleets just to fly into India. But India firmly stood its ground. No compromises on safety. And because the Indian market was just way too important to ignore, the world's airlines really had no choice but to comply, which rapidly accelerated global adoption.
Let's look at exactly how this mandated tech works, because it's a real game changer. TCAS completely bypasses human error, language barriers, and radar delays by taking direct, automated control. Here's how it plays out. Step 1. If another aircraft breaches that crucial 1,000-foot vertical separation buffer we talked about, the system detects it completely independently of the ground ATC. Step 2. A loud, urgent alarm triggers instantly inside the cockpit. And Step 3. This is the magic of TCAS right here. It doesn't just warn the pilots, it automatically calculates the escape route. The system talks to the other plane and instructs one pilot to climb and the other to descend. It literally takes the guesswork entirely out of the equation.
And finally, Part 5, a safer global sky. So the crucial point is that India's sweeping reforms didn't stop at just mandating new tech. The Charkhi Dadri disaster exposed huge vulnerabilities in how pilots and controllers communicated, prompting reforms that fundamentally changed international aviation standards. They systematically eliminated every single vulnerability. That dangerous single bidirectional corridor? Gone, replaced by separated air corridors for incoming and departing flights. The unreliable altitude data? Fixed by the implementation of secondary radar and that mandatory TCAS we just covered. And perhaps most impactfully on a global scale, to fix the deadly misinterpretation of ATC instructions, India went straight to the International Civil Aviation Organization in 1998 and strongly pushed to mandate a minimum level of English proficiency for all international pilots. It was heavily debated but ultimately adopted. Today, you absolutely cannot fly an international route without proving you can clearly communicate in English.
Because of these strict mandates driven by the tragic lessons of Charkhi Dadri, mid-air collisions of commercial airliners have effectively been eradicated. The skies have literally never been safer. But I want to leave you with a thought here. Technology is constantly evolving, right? Our airspace is getting increasingly crowded with drones, brand new automated systems, and unprecedented flight volumes. So the question isn't whether we've solved the problems of 1996. We absolutely have. The real question is, as aviation continues to advance, what are the new invisible holes in today's systems, and more importantly, are we observant enough to plug them before the Swiss cheese aligns again? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and as always, keep asking the big questions.